Thanks for having me. So, anyone who's seen me around at various video game meetups will know I'm actually making board games, but for about 15 years before that I was a programmer, and still am. So for some reason to me it seemed the more natural community to hang out with than the board game community. This is also because, and this is kind of part of the point of just doing this talk, is the board game community is still very, for the most part, quite old-fashioned and resistant to change. Well, that is changing, but they're quite traditional people. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how video games have influenced board games and vice versa in kind of the past couple of years. So firstly, starting with a very easy one, but and maybe slightly out of place in the rest of the presentation, but in our world, the funding and promotion of projects has been moving a lot towards things like Kickstarter and crowdfunding. This is Exploding Kittens. It's a little of an unfair one because it has some very big names behind it, like the Oatmeal, but this was the most successful board game. I mean, it's just a card game, really, but ever on Kickstarter. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's a genre. Board games on Kickstarter tend to do quite well, unless you're making something that is a complete pile of dung. Then they tend to be quite successful, and it's quite an easy format to get things like rewards and stretch goals and things like that. So they've been increasingly popular. The negative of that is it's a popular category as well, of course, so competition. And then perhaps the biggest problem has been the reality of actually delivering the game at the end. When you're making a physical product, which is usually being printed in China or somewhere like that, it takes extra steps and extra costs and extra research to get that working. Other examples of games that have been very popular in the kind of new world of promotion are things like Cards Against Humanity, God Hates Charades. These are all similar kind of fun card game type games, but there are some other board games that have worked very well as well. It's not liked by everybody in the board game community. A lot of them see them as, I don't know, just, I think it's that they see Kickstarter games not always as a sign of quality, which is not true or fair, but as I said, it's a traditional community. But moving on to the more digital side of things. So in this sort of area, game apps and apps of games have influenced board games and vice versa. This is an example here of an older board game called Ticket to Ride, or in German Zug um Zug, on the tablet. It works pretty well. There's plenty of others like this. Most of the classic popular board games of the past few years have been made into app versions. They allow for things like solo play, network play. They broaden the market, of course. They can vary in terms of the quality and how well they work. For example, this works sort of okay, but when you're reducing a board of this sort of size to something maybe that big, there's going to be some sacrifices made. But then other games have worked very well and have been thought about slightly differently. And anything that is sort of a turn-based can work quite well. Looking the other way, there's actually some games like XCOM, which ironically, of course, there's a board game of XCOM which was originally a video game, but the board game has an app, which is slightly confusing. But what the app does, it isn't the game itself, it's like an AI of the game. So it's a cooperative game where players are, much like the original XCOM, trying to defend the world from alien invasion, and the app each turn will actually tell you like what happens on the board. So the app plays the game. It's sort of, I think a lot of people thought it would be mind-blowing and then everybody would copy it, and no one has yet. But it was an interesting idea. And another one is something like One Night Ultimate Werewolf. Werewolf is a kind of classic party game where you have hidden roles, and there's an app to it that sort of narrates you through the turn and tells you what to do, when, and things like that. So these kind of game assistants have become quite popular. Even games like Munchkin, which is a sort of card adventure game, has lots and lots of app associates that help you keep track of scores and things like that, because obviously it's very complicated to keep track of scores. I don't know. And even in the last edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which is not necessarily a board game, but we'll stick with it for now, it had a lot more digital assistance. Wizards of the Coast actually had a lot of game character generation, things like that online. And then with this edition, have pretty much got rid of all of it. I think some people felt like it was becoming too much like a computer game. And others, I think, skeptically, I actually think a lot of it was leading to piracy, strangely. But because now they've gone kind of fully back down the paper and just book path. We will see. And interestingly, so from the talk and play last time, I heard about This War of Mine, which I then bought on Steam, and that is now being made into a board game. And that sort of game would actually work very well as a board game. And things like Civilization have been turned into a board game, Space Hulk. I put Space Hulk. Space Hulk was actually a board game first, but there's a lot of exchange between the two, and it's not just video games that become board games, but vice versa as well. But more interestingly, at the moment, this is kind of the cutting edge of the board game world, and this is board game simulators. Vassal was one of the first. It's kind of an open source project that's a bit clunky to use, but then in the past few years there's been things like Tabletop Simulator, which has been quite popular, and then some more independent ones coming up at the moment are Tabletopia, Tabletop Zen. There's none without table in the title, obviously, and even something like Roll20, which again is a role-play simulator. What these do is they don't really play the games, but they give you a series of emulated tokens and cards and board pieces, and then an arena to play in that offers things like network play, counters, chat windows. So it's a good way of being able to play a board game with people all over the world. And for designers, they're great for play testing. But they get around things like copyright by not actually supplying the rules. You kind of have to know how to play the game. And getting your game onto them is not a particularly complicated affair. I've been playing with these a lot. You upload assets, and that's about it. They're usually just PNGs. None of these are very complex yet. What would be great if they had something like an API so you could actually sort of automate the process of getting things into them. But they're a fairly new area for board games, and I think still remains to be seen whether they'll be popular or not, because in my mind they sort of somewhat miss the point of playing a board game. If you're playing it on a computer, you might as well be playing a computer game, really, maybe, I don't know. But that's kind of the latest thing in the board game world at the moment. And where I'd like to take this myself, coming from a programmer background, I've been thinking about with this and how I could actually, if anyone's familiar with like test-driven development in terms of programming, how I could theoretically test-driven development a board game by creating digital assets, somehow writing the rules, and then running tests to see if the game components are breaking the rules or not. But of course the thing with board games is that they still do involve humans, and they're harder to test, as we all know. But thanks for having me. That's a chinchilla, in case you didn't know. My game is called Chip Shop, and you can sign up to playtest. And as Lorenzo said, I'm a bit sick, so I don't know if I'll be sticking around, but if you have any questions or anything like that, then please let me know. Thanks very much.